All right, closing out lesson one with part four. Charles Baudelaire, a poet. I'm so glad we're at a poet. I love a short lyric poet. I love closing out lectures with poets because poetry is short and sweet. Um, and we've had a lot to cover this lecture with three pieces of historical context and with Faust being such a demanding text and Sister Juana's response being such a great and wonderful text. I'm happy we'll end on a short, sweet note here, but a very dark and corrupt sweet note because it's Baudelaire. So let's get right to it. Baudelaire is known for his shocking, painful, and exquisite poetry. No one has combined the beautiful and the gross better than Baudelaire, and it made him the most famous French poet of his time. He was haunted. He grew up in the city. He saw the changes to urbanization and to modernity firsthand, and he was haunted by what he saw. He saw human nature as fallen and corrupt, so he was drawn to explore his own weakness and transgressions, but also the sins or weaknesses and transgressions of society. So his poetry is always self-reflective, but also critical of society at the same time, which is part of his appeal, I think. I've always loved Baudelaire, and I like that he's not just critiquing society, he's also critiquing himself. He was, like I said, the most famous French poet of his time. What are his significant contributions? Certainly this anguished worldview was very unique to him, and even though we see anguished worldviews all the time, I don't think anyone's done it quite as well as Baudelaire. But really, he's the first modern poet. You know, he's writing in the mid-19th century, but he opens the way to understanding what it means to be modern. He was the first poet to have this level of success who really wrote about what it was like to live in an urban, modern world. And it was grotesque, but the poetry was beautiful. And so the combining of the beautiful and the grotesque is completely unique to Baudelaire, but completely modern as well. So he's like the first modern poet, and he helped giving this vision of poetry to the world, helped other poets see how to think about being modern. And so he opened a lot of doors for other writers in transitioning to the modern world. His poems combine shocking, brutal, and disgusting imagery with perfectly controlled and artistically beautiful forms. So his poetry is very structured and very technical. So the form is beautiful, even if the language or the content is brutal, disgusting, shocking, gross, etc. A huge part of Baudelaire's poetry is the setting. You have to roll with the setting with Baudelaire, and it was Paris. It was urban Paris. Again, he was one of the first poets to really see and observe the urban modern world. And why is it grotesque? The textbook describes it well, but you'd have people living in utter poverty, and you'd have decadent shops and stores right next to where the poverty was. And that was unique to urbanism and modernism. In the rural world that existed before the urban modern one did, there was more separation between the rich and the poor. But I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm saying seeing them intermixed right next to each other right on the city streets was completely unique. It would shock people, and Baudelaire captured it in his poetry very well, before anyone else did. Finally, he invented the term flaneur, which is a new term he invented. It means saunter, and it's what he did, walk through the new modern urban city streets to see its fleeting spectacles, to see the filthy poor next to the decadent storefront, walking around and seeing that was a new thing and had to have a new word for it. So that's just another one of his contributions. Okay, so what are a little bit of background? What are some of the really interesting things we get from his poetry? I said he was the first modern and first urban poet. He used strictly traditional metrical forms and rhyme schemes, so as other romantic modern type poets in the mid 19th century, say like his contemporary Walt Whitman in America, for instance, were using free verse, like Whitman around the same time basically invented free verse. For all of the shocking nature of Baudelaire's poetry, the actual structure, the verse form, the rhyme, and the meter are very traditional. And that's, I think it has to be that way. If it were grotesque and shocking and the structure were completely chaotic, you wouldn't have any balance. And Baudelaire's all about balance, tension. Along those lines, balance and tension, you have irony as a major part of his poetry. Remember, I mentioned this before, irony is where you have one thing going on the surface, a different thing actually happening beneath the surface. And so Baudelaire is the type of writer I love because he's contrary. I'm a contrarian myself, and he will give you an idea and then immediately undermine it with a more cynical one. That's the enthralling irony of Baudelaire's poetry. He also uses the term spleen. You'll see several poems in here called spleen, which he basically means disgust with life. And it's really a sadness. The Greeks believed sadness as a feeling originated with fluids from the spleen. And so Baudelaire uses the term spleen in the poems called that to evoke this kind of sadness about modern life. Another important term you have to know to understand Baudelaire is ennui. Ennui is this term that basically means boredom, but a high level of dissatisfaction with being bored, so much so that it can lead to depression. And again, this was a very modern condition. In the rural world, people had farms to work, land to work, and that always took time. You didn't have free time or downtime. But in the city, you would have alienation, isolation. And so what do you do with that? Eventually, this just feeling of dissatisfaction that can really go to dark places emerges, and that's ennui. His poems, this is the quintessential thing. I should have highlighted this one more. There's always this tension between beauty and sadness. Sometimes it's corruption or disgust instead of sadness, but there's always this tension between the beauty of the poem and the harsh reality of the modern world. And finally, the title of his collection of poetry, The Flowers of Evil, it encapsulates that tension perfectly. Flowers, evil. Beauty, corruption. Beauty, disgust. Beauty, sadness. That's Baudelaire. Okay, so this is the first time we're reading short lyric poetry. We've read a short story, really a novella, with Un Cours Simple. We've read a travel narrative. We've read a letter. And we've read a long, complex drama. So we're really highlighting the different genres. That was one of my goals. But the three main literary forms are fiction, drama, and poetry. With poetry, you typically have long, epic poetry, which is poetry that tells a narrative, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc. And then you have short lyric poetry, which is what we have here and really what most people think of today when they hear the word poetry. So how do you read this? It's different. If you were to just read it the way you say read Faust or A Simple Heart, you would not take very long because there's not that many words on a page. There's a lot of empty space on the page compared to Faust, and you'd not know what the heck you just read. So poetry is by definition not literal, and it's short, at least with lyric poetry. And so it demands a greater degree of interpretation. So you need to spend as much time reading Baudelaire as you do Faust. I know that seems impractical because it's much shorter, but you'll get more out of the poems if you spend as much time on them as you do on the longer pieces. Well, how do you spend that time? You have to suss out the figurative language, the poetic devices. Something like Faust, as poetic as it is written in pretty literal language. You can read each line, and you don't have to spend too long thinking about what it means. Poetry is really like another language. My best instruction for reading and interpreting short lyric poetry is to treat it like a foreign language. And so you have to interpret as you go. So here's are the steps I suggest you take. Read the poem out loud so you can hear it. You're going to have to read it a lot of times. So read it out loud. Paraphrase the poem line by line. So in the margin, translate. Like I was saying, translate the poem. Pretend it's a foreign language because it's figurative language rather than literal language. So it's not far off from a foreign language. So treat it like a foreign language, and that means not just interpret, but translate each line. On the page next to it, write what you think the line means in a more straightforward, literal sense. If you were paraphrasing the poem, how would you do that? Then read through your paraphrase. Read through line by line how you've translated it. And finally, once you've done all that, reread the poem again. So read it, translate or paraphrase it, read it again. Probably read it more times because they're so short. Read it slowly. Read it out loud. But these things, each reading, especially if you're translating or paraphrasing, it will gain depth. It'll gain ground. You'll see things you didn't before. So this is demanding. This will take time. You could spend just as much time doing this for each Baudelaire poem as it took to read 50 pages of Goethe. And that's all I say in this long quote here. And so it's challenging, demanding, hard to do. You've got jobs, you've got lives, but if you can take the time, it'll be rewarding. I would rather spend twice as much time doing this to Baudelaire than reading Faust, just being honest with you. Okay, so let's do this. If you go through the Flowers of Evil, I've asked you to read all of the poems. I'm going to do this each time we have short lyric poetry. Later in the course, we're going to read Rainer Maria Rilke and Pablo Neruda, who are two of my favorite lyric poets. And so each time we read a poet like this with the short lyric poems, I'm going to ask you to read all of the poems because they're short. So you don't have to do what I just suggested with every single poem, but I'd like you to read through the poems once or twice and then pick a few of your favorites and apply the methodology I just outlined on the previous slide so that you get a lot out of the few of the ones you like the best. And so I'm not going to cover all of these poems from Flowers of Evil in this lecture because I'm guessing right now you're about ready for me to wrap it up. You don't want to be here another 2 hours or 4 hours or however long it take me to do that. So when it comes to short lyric poems, I really have the opportunity to do what I've always wanted to do, which is only give you a little bit in the lecture and let you do the rest in the discussion board. So I'll probably at most, depending on the poet and the length of the poems, provide interpretations of 2 to 3 poems max, and then you have the rest to do. And so I really look forward to reading your discussion board posts. With Flowers, that's a general rule for when we have short lyric poets. With the Flowers of Evil, I'm going to hit a few highlights here because the first 4 poems, To the Reader, Correspondences, Her Hair, and The Corpse. A Carcass, that's for the, I couldn't remember the name of it, A Carcass. Those 4 are probably the 4 most famous ones, and they really encapsulate the beauty and gross thing that is the quintessential Baudelaire. They encapsulate those well. I don't need to read and interpret for you in this lecture A Carcass for you to see how this rotting carcass with the smells and how it relates to his beloved on the walk, how he brings the beauty and the gross together and how that's modern. That should be fairly obvious. Hopefully you get to that as you read it. But what I'm going to do is provide just a couple insights from To the Reader and Her Hair by looking at just short sections, one stanza from each of them. to highlight how some of the most important things about Baudelaire show up in these very famous poems of his. And then I'm going to take a less famous poem, Invitation to the Voyage, which I think is a really beautiful poem. I love this poem. I weep when I read it. And I'd rather break it down for you than a carcass because it's beautiful, as fun as it is to read a carcass. And so I want to model for you through my analysis of Invitation to the Voyage how to do the interpretation of poetry that I just did, or that I just outlined on the previous slide. But before that, I'm going to hit a couple highlights from two of his most famous poems. So To the Reader brilliant captures Unway. He's talking about all the grotesque things of modernity, and he says he's got one more. And then he says, it's boredom. You basically have ennui defined in this final stanza. He says, it's boredom. Tears have glued its eyes together. You know it well, my reader, this obscene beast chain smokes, yawning for the guillotine. You, hypocrite reader, my double, my brother. I love Baudelaire. This is classic Baudelaire. It cracks me up because, like I said on the threads, he sees his own sins as much as the sins of others. So this is to the reader. Most poets, when they write a collection of short lyric poems, have an introduction where they invite the reader to read their poems. That's what Baudelaire is doing here. But he insults the reader. He calls the reader a hypocrite. So on the one hand, I love that he's bold enough in his initial address to the reader to call the reader a hypocrite. But then he goes on and says, my double, my brother. So he sees himself. He sees that same hypocrisy in himself, not just in the reader. That's the beauty of Baudelaire. Then in her hair, he says, I'll plunge my head, enamored of its pleasure, in this black ocean where the other hides. My subtle spirit then will know a measure of fertile idleness and fragrant leisure, lulled by the infinite rhythm of its tides. So this is actually beautiful, right? It's a beautiful description of her hair. And he uses a kind of a device poets often use where they take something beautiful and they expand it. So her hair becomes an ocean here. But he's plunged his head into her hair, which is this visceral kind of off-putting image. So you have beauty and earthiness joined together. The speaker sees a beautiful ocean in the listener's hair, but the sensuous plunging of his head into her hair grounds the beautiful scene in an earthy, modern, real moment. So it seems like you're drifting off to this tranquil place, this ocean of beautiful hair. But then you've got this guy sticking his head right in the hair, and you're snapped back to reality. Again, very quintessential Baudelaire. All right, I'm going to endeavor to demonstrate for you how to translate and interpret poetry as you go so that you get more out of it than you initially see. There's a few things to keep in mind. Hopefully you've taken the Introduction to Poetry course. That's a prerequisite for these surveys because these surveys have a lot of poetry, and in them we get into the technical things, the devices, metaphor, etc. We also need to understand the dramatic situation. So every poem has a speaker and a listener. We can never assume that the speaker is the same as the author. Oftentimes they are, but many times they're intentionally not. And so when we read short lyric poetry, I'll use these terms, speaker and listener. So you need to know that context. And I'll also reference other things like metaphor or synecdoche or metonym. And hopefully you know what those are. Hopefully you've done some scansion, the mapping out of the stressed and unstressed beats in your Intro to Poetry course so that you're familiar with some of the unique terminology that's specific to poetry. But again, that's a prereq for this class, so I'm going to assume you have that background. I'm going to dive right in. But remember, speaker is the one speaking. There's always an audience they're addressing. They're not necessarily the same as the poet. So I'm going to read this poem. Even in translation, it's beautiful. And then we'll go through it line by line. Invitation to the Voyage, Charles Baudelaire. My child, my sister, dream, how sweet all things would seem, Were we in that kind land to live together, and their love slow and long, their love and die among those scenes that image you, that sumptuous weather, drowned suns that glimmer there, through cloud dishevelled air, move me with such a mystery as appears within those other skies of your treacherous eyes, when I behold them shining through their tears. There is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. Furniture that wears the lustre of the years softly would glow within our glowing chamber. Flowers of rarest bloom, proffering their perfume, mixed with the vague fragrances of amber. Gold ceilings would there be, mirrors deep as the sea. The walls all in an eastern splendor hung, nothing but should address the soul's loneliness, speaking her sweet and secret native tongue. There is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. See, sheltered from the swells, there in the still canals, those drowsy ships that dream of sailing forth, is it to satisfy your least desire they ply? Hither through all the waters of the earth, the sun at close of day, clothes the fields of hay. Then the canals, at last the town entire, in hyacinth and gold, slowly the land is rolled, sleepward under a sea of gentle fire. There is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. All right, how can you not love poetry? Let's take it line by line. Do a stanza per slide here. I've italicized the poem so that in the non-italicized you can see my translation or my paraphrase. My child, my sister, dream how sweet all things would seem were we in that kind land to live together. And their love slow and long, their love and die among those scenes that image you, that sumptuous weather. Drowned suns that glimmer there, through cloud dishevelled air, move me with such a mystery as appears within those other skies of your treacherous eyes, when I behold them shining through their tears. So I think in the first three lines here, the speaker wants to take his beloved to paradise. There's a long tradition of male speakers addressing female listeners, and that female listener is typically referred to as a beloved. Baudelaire often, as he does in Her Hair, often evokes this tradition and then revises it and changes it. So he wants to take his beloved to paradise. They could live their whole lives there. The beautiful weather images her or reflects her beauty. The beloved is often beautiful, but clouds appear. And so we think of paradise probably as like a tropical beach. That's the typical connotation. I think he's playing with that. And clouds appearing there kind of offsets the mood. It's not as an abrupt or as a shocking of an image as taking a walk and finding a carcass, but it's similar to plunging your head into a person's head of hair. So the clouds appear, and we go from having just what we typically associate with paradise to having something there that doesn't seem to quite fit. And clouds, we know, can be full of rain. So he says, of your treacherous eyes. That really throws it off. Now we have treachery in paradise. And this beautiful speaker is a very loving dedication with that one word treacherous slipped in. So it's what I would call it is a complicated paradise. It's not a straightforward tropical paradise, but it's not gross like a carcass is. It's just a complicated paradise. It's not all simple. There's treachery, there's clouds. But after of your treacherous eyes, he says, when I behold them shining through their tears, which is really a beautiful image. You can see the eyes through the tears, and clouds, like eyes, are filled with water, and they can pour out rain just as eyes can pour out tears. And it's a very common, kind of obvious metaphor he's using here, I think intentionally. Comparing a woman to the weather, to the sunny weather in paradise is a common trope. Comparing tear-filled eyes to clouds is common, but he's bringing the two together in an interesting way. He's characterizing both his beloved and paradise as not perfect, but something he wants. And so I mentioned before how Baudelaire has a very traditional structure. So we have 3 stanzas with a refrain, a repeated phrase, almost like a chorus in a song, in between each stanza. And so this first stanza sets the stage by characterizing both his beloved and paradise as something complicated, not perfect, complicated and not perfect, but beautiful, and something he desires. Let's look at the refrain. Then there is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. These are all positive qualities. Grace, measure, richness, quietness, pleasure. But he's seeing them. He says, there. Where is there? Paradise, the beloved. I think the beloved and paradise are like one and the same. It's a sumptuous paradise where the suns are drowned by clouds. So again, that idea of complicated but beautiful and desired by the speaker. And really a beautiful tribute to his beloved with these words: grace, measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. Is not perfect, but I'd want to be there. Okay, the second stanza. Furniture that wears the luster of the years softly would glow within our glowing chamber. Flowers of rarest bloom, proffering their perfume, mixed with the vague fragrances of amber. Gold ceilings would there be, mirrors deep as the sea. The walls all in eastern splendor hung, nothing but should address the soul's loneliness, speaking her sweet and secret native tongue. So even the furniture would glow in this paradise. Now he's not describing the exterior, the beach and whatnot. He's describing their home, kind of a progression there between the stanzas. But even the furniture would glow because this is paradise, but it glows with the luster of the years, and it's furniture that wears. So again, it's not perfect. It's tinged with these complications. And then I call it a unique preserved place. Amber preserves things, but then that smell is mixed with the rarest of flowers. So you smell the flowers, which are rare or unique. So the place is rare or unique, but that smell mixes with amber. So it's a preserved place. So you get the sense that it's weathered. It's been there a while, which again is like his beloved. She's been around long enough to have treacherous, tear-filled eyes. Mirror as deep as the sea. So there's a sense of vastness too that goes with experience and weathering. At the end, he says, the soul's loneliness, speaking her sweet and native tongue. So with the idea of the mirror here, this place reflects the beauty of life. That's why it could image his beloved. But it's always tinged with the wear of hard years that make it all more beautiful. So the soul's loneliness, speaking her sweet and secret native tongue. So the soul is lonely, that's sad, but it speaks in a sweet voice. Again, there's this pairing of beauty and complication. But the poem's not just repeating the same idea over and over again. If we were to sum up the poem so far in one phrase as complicated beauty, what this second stanza does is it adds another layer, which is part of the reason things are complicated is because they've seen years of wear and tear, perhaps in a harsh modern world. So stanza 1 is complicated beauty. I would say stanza 2 is beauty complicated by years of wear and tear. I'll read the refrain again. There is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. I didn't do a new slide for each refrain because it's literally the same words. But even as I read them aloud now for this lecture, I'm realizing, like I said, the more times you read a poem, the more things you realize. So what I'm saying is, why repeat the phrase there twice. The word there twice. There, there. I think he's talking about two things: the beloved and paradise. I think that's why one of the reasons why he says it twice. Third stanza. See, sheltered from the swells, there in the still canals, those drowsy ships that dream of sailing forth. It is to satisfy your least desire they ply, hither through all the waters of the earth. The sun at close of day clothes the fields of hay. Then the canals at last the town entire, in hyacinth and gold. Slowly the land is rolled, sleepward under a sea of gentle fire. So you have an image of the ships in port here in the canals. They're not moving. The canals are still. These drowsy ships that dream of sailing forth. So they could sail. They could sail to this paradise. We've already seen the paradise as a kind of a beach. It is to satisfy. So he's almost, I guess he's not quite asking a question. Like I have it as a question. Now I'm seeing he's more so stating a fact. But it's kind of it is not really a wondering, but he's kind of posing it to her, I guess, like a rhetorical question to her. It is to satisfy your least desire they ply, hither through all the waters of the earth. So these ships are there to take her to paradise, but they're not moving because it's her least desire. That one short half line, those three short, all one syllable words really say a lot. That's the new layer this stanza adds, is she doesn't want to go to paradise. The ships aren't moving. So then the sun at close of day clothes the fields of hay. So the sun is going down, and as it's sinking down, it's covering the fields of hay. Then it covers the canals, and at last the town entire. So it's covering more and more. And hyacinth and gold. So hyacinth is purple, but gold seems to be key there. That's a word that stands out, and I pair it with amber from the last stanza. So as the sun is sinking, the world looks yellow. So it's this yellow, the sun has painted the world yellow. It's covered the hay, the canals, the town entire. Now slowly the land is rolled, sleepward under a sea of gentle fire. So the yellow sun has, at the end of the day, covered the canals, the hay, the entire town, and now the entire land. Sleepward under a sea of gentle fire. It's interesting that the land is not sleeping under a setting sun. It's sleeping under a sea of gentle fire. I mean, what a complicated, beautiful image to unpack in the last line of a poem before the refrain. So everything goes to sleep under a yellow tinged sea of gentle fire. So there's fire, but it's gentle. So again, it's not the harshness of a carcass, but it's a complicated vision. It's not simple and beautiful. And so again, there's that refrain, that one idea all the way through of complicated beauty. And if the second stand gave us beauty complicated by years of wear and tear, I would say beauty complicated by years of wear and tear of a beloved who doesn't want to go there being paradise. So you have kind of this desire of the speaker, or at least the opportunity he's offering to go to paradise. And we see what paradise is like in the first two stanzas with some layers added to it in the second stanza. In the final stanza, we see that they're not going there. So that's sad. But let's read that beautiful refrain one more time and then see what we get out of this poem. There is nothing else but grace and measure, richness, quietness, and pleasure. It shows how Baudelaire's poetry can be utterly beautiful, but still inflected with the ache of modernity. What is paradise? It's beautiful, but it's tinged with this ache. So a modern like Baudelaire, paradise can't be untainted or untinged. You don't have a perfect paradise. Paradise, as we traditionally conceive of paradise, can't exist in a modern world because the modern world is brutal. It's a common Baudelaire trope where the speaker addresses his beloved, evoking that long poetic tradition, whom he loves and sees as beautiful, but she's a realistic rather than idealized beauty. The beloveds of the poems of the Renaissance and earlier were all eyes like the sun and stuff like that, and even hundreds of years before Baudelaire, Shakespeare made fun of it, but it's realistic. She's beautiful. She's a beautiful woman, but she's got tear-filled, treacherous eyes, so she's also a real woman. Um, the poem reveals one of the main conditions of modernity, and this is how you have paradise, a beloved, you have beauty, but there's an ache. It's not simple, it's complicated. An inability to act. We'll talk more about modernity as the class goes on, but it relates to the idea of ennui. In an earlier phase of life, people didn't struggle with an action, just like they didn't struggle with boredom. There's always exceptions, I'm saying, to the same extent. Certain things came about as part of modernism. In modernism, you had passivity come up for as kind of a new thing of people not willing to be people of action, men not willing to be men of action, a paralysis of the will, and inability to act. So the still canals, the ships that aren't moving, the beloved who doesn't want to go to paradise. We have an insight into the not just the ache of modernity, but the specific ache of modernity here. What is troubling this specific speaker? So that's a pretty sad ending. But while what we learn may seem dreary, the beauty found in the poem is encouraging. So while this is a sad vision, Baudelaire's, or the speaker, has embraced it, has embraced that vision to a certain extent. He loves his beloved. And even if she doesn't want to go to paradise, he does. So there's beauty in the grotesque. There's beauty in the dreary and the sad. And Baudelaire embraces that duality. And so that's why I love his poetry, and that's why I think it can be encouraging, even though it's sad, even though it's gross, like in a carcass. So hopefully that was a good illustration of how to really spend, rather than a poem, it takes me 2 minutes to read aloud, but I spent 20 minutes interpreting it. I ask that you commit that same time to 2 or 3 poems. And because I can't cover all of them in the lecture, I'm really, like I said, even more so than usual, looking forward to reading your discussion board posts.